Thank you all for joining us, sending a warm welcome to everyone here with us. Today we will be joined by our guest speakers, Naomi Brown from the Framing Initiative at the Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership and Associate Professor Angela Higginson from the School of Justice at the Queensland University of Technology, who will be sharing how framing can support ethical, inclusive and impactful storytelling in research and evaluation. I'm Nadia, the Research and Data Officer at QCOS, the Queensland Council of Social Service. I work in the research policy team, and along with our senior data analyst Amy, together we facilitate the Research and Evaluation Network. QCOS is the peak body for community services in Queensland, and our vision is to achieve equality, opportunity and well-being for every person in every community across Queensland. QCOS acknowledges the historical injustice of colonisation and dispossession on First Nations peoples and its ongoing impact and legacies. We are committed to reconciliation, self-determination and opportunity for First Nations peoples as integral steps in achieving equality, opportunity and well-being for all Queenslanders. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the oldest continuing cultures, diverse languages and knowledge holders in human history. I am joining you from Meanjin, Brisbane, and I respectfully acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal people and all First Nations colleagues and friends online in the webinar today. For those online in the meeting, please feel free to join us in acknowledging country where you are today through the chat function. The agenda for today's session will be the presentation by our guest speakers, followed by a Q&A, the poll, and the Research Evaluation Network details, as well as upcoming events. A couple of things to note. By default, you will be on mute, but your camera will be turned on. This session will be recorded. If during the session you would like to ask a question, you can write the question in the chat function. If we do run out of time, we will follow up with you individually after the session, so just ensure you pop your question or comment into the chat pane. At the end of each year, we send out a survey to hear directly from you, our network members, about topics you'd like us to explore. Your feedback plays a key role in shaping the Research and Evaluation Network's webinar program. Here you can see the results from last year's survey, which guided us in selecting today's topic, as well as the other topics held for the network this year. Today's presentation brings together several of the most requested themes from that survey, namely data storytelling and communicating impact, strength-based data and reporting, and capturing the voice of children and young people. As we are approaching the end of this year, we have our annual feedback survey for you, our network participants. This is a voluntary survey with the purpose to understand, measure, and demonstrate the value of the network and how we can further tailor network activities to support the community services sector, data research and evaluation needs. Our team will share the results of the network survey with you in our next webinar in December. You can also see all the webinars we've had so far for the network this year on the slide as a reminder of topics we have covered. You'll find the link to the survey in the chat and it will be included in the post-event email also. With that in mind, I'd like to welcome our guest speakers for today's event. Naomi Brown, who is the Principal Partnership Manager at the Framing Initiative at the Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership, and Associate Professor Angela Higginson from the School of Justice at the Queensland University of Technology. I will hand over to Naomi to introduce the topic of framing in the context of communicating research and data about children and young people. And then Angela will present on her research and the Australian Youth Safety Survey. And to wrap up, we will hear from Naomi again about practical resources and tools for framing research. So over to you, Naomi.
Great, thank you everybody. Can I just check that the screens are working properly?
Yes, it looks
You
perfect.
can see the Fantastic. Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity and excited to hear from Angela and the conversation we might have afterwards. I also want to just echo the acknowledgement you just gave, Nadia, and pay my respects to elders, past and present, of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lands that all of us across Queensland live on, but particularly for me here, Turrbal and on the edges of Turrbal and Yagara country. And because we're about to talk about storytelling and framing, I also just want to acknowledge that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures are so expert at storytelling. And for generations, they've told stories about collective care, of country and of children, and there's so much we can learn and acknowledge that this is not new work, but in our current public mindset, public narratives, it's not as common. So what I'm going to cover today is a little bit about what is framing, why it matters, and an introduction around mindsets. I'll be leaning into the work of Frameworks Institute because they've been a critical friend with us at Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership in this work. But trying to pull out and highlight where framing with data and telling stories with data comes through in the recommendations from their work. We'll hear from Angela, which is I'm excited to hear, and then we'll come back together and talk about how does this tie together. What are some tools and resources that you can use going forward? It's only 20 minutes, this first section, so it's going to be a taster. We won't be able to cover it all, but hopefully you'll get one or two pieces of things you can take away and use, and one or two suggestions of where you might want to go further if you want to dig into this a little more. So who am I? Just a short introduction. Just to let you know, I really come from a not-for-profit, working in not-for-profit organisations and community services for more than 20 years, if I want to admit it. But in the last 2.5 years, I've joined Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership, who are set up as an intermediary, really looking to make big, bold systems change for Queensland's children and young people. And early on, when they were thinking about the conditions for systems change, that recognised that how we talk about what's working and what's needed is really impactful for the change we will need. And so in doing that, have funded this role and the intention of this work alongside other pieces of work to really build that change. So with that, we've been the last few years been looking at how we provide support to ourselves, how we support ourselves to implement this learning, and also those around us, because it's a whole sector shift in narrative that we need to see, not just our child and youth sector, but all of the parts that contribute to our public narrative around this work. So Frameworks Institute, as I said, has been a critical friend. They've done more than 15 years work here in Australia. They're an international organisation that's really expert at researching around mindsets and how our general public think and feel about a particular issue that we want to communicate with, what we're trying to say, and what's the gap between those two, and what are some of the frames or tools we can use to tell a compelling story. I just want to also acknowledge that this work's been hosted in partnership with Queensland Family and Child Commission, and just acknowledge their support. So we've been engaging widely to look to glean and learn together what are the strategic opportunities. We've been offering learning opportunities, bite-sized ones like this, but also more in-depth opportunities to learn about what the framing recommendations and research has been telling us and how we use it. We've been building a community of practice, which anyone is welcome to join. And then also provide learning some peer-to-peer learning opportunities to go a little deeper with organisations that really want to take their whole organisation through a change in how they're utilising their language. And to do that, we've also been creating some tools and examples that we can share with anybody and with you, we'll share with you at the end. So some examples just quickly, and then I'm going to move into the framing. We've been seeing our partners use this framing research in funding campaigns, in reports, in calls for advocacy around election time or particular policy calls, down to also using it in their language when they're talking with their families and communities around their work. So just to pause, if we were in the room, I'd be asking you for a thumbs up or thumbs down in terms of just getting a sense of how familiar you are with this work. You might not have any idea what I'm talking about. You might know a little. You might have been involved in some of the foundational framing researchers here in Australia. I'm sure there's going to be a diversity across the room. But I think we can all think of a moment when we tried to communicate something and it just landed differently to how we expected. There was this lost in translation moment. And I think one of the keys around this is how we set up what we're talking about, how we frame the initial start of our work, of our communication. So I'm going to define what I mean by framing so we're all on the same page for this particular presentation. And I'm going to utilize the Frameworks Institute definition, so we're all utilizing something similar. But I want to acknowledge that we've all got different backgrounds, experience, lived experience and professional experience. And we've got some really good understandings of how we communicate. We might have come from a strengths-based process, or we might be very good at picking where our language is child-friendly or not child-friendly. There's a rich learnings that we already come with to this work around communication and words and how they matter. So for the rest of this presentation, when I talk about framing, I'm not meaning a picture in an art gallery. I'm really talking about how we set up. Well, I'm going to use the definition, not try and. We're talking about the choices we make, about how we present our ideas. And so that includes what we might emphasize, what we might explain, but also what we might leave unsaid. And recognize that this then, sorry, my clicking's wrong. This then affects how people think and feel about the issue that we're talking about. And then that's impacted by the cultural mindsets that are forefront which is forefront when we're communicating. So moving to what do we mean by mindsets? We're looking at something that's implicit. That's the patterns of thinking. Sorry, just going to grab my thing. The patterns of thinking and reasoning that are sort of below the surface in somebody and in our community. They also, mindsets shape how we see the world, how we see what shapes us around the world. We can have multiple mindsets on the same issue in the same person at any one time. And some of those mindsets are more productive. They lead to conversation and understanding and support. And some of those mindsets are less productive. They shut down our conversation, and they can be quite destructive and sometimes very negative in the way and shut down those conversations, so they're less productive in our work. So finally, oh, gee. The scroll button. Finally, how the choices we make in how we communicate and frame up our work will either draw out a more productive mindset or can inadvertently activate a less productive mindset in the way we communicate. So what do I mean by that? I'm going to share 3 big mindsets that are found internationally, but also here in Australia through the work. That's pretty obvious when I start to say them. Are less helpful in when we're communicating things that we're passionate about, that we want to see changing. We'll then share the 3 strategies to counter these mindsets. So the first one is individualism, a mindset that says the world is the way it is because of individual choice and character, whether someone's got motivation or is lazy, that it's the way it is because of an individual. We obviously respect and know that individual choice and agency is very important, but without sharing the context around that individual, we can miss the opportunity to look at solutions that are beyond the individual, because often this mindset will then blame the individual for the circumstance they find themselves in. So not a good one to be eliciting when we're wanting to talk about change. A second one is fatalism, that idea that problems are too complex, too hard. We're always going to have this or poverty. Well, we're always going to have poverty with us, or we're always going to have problems with young people. And it often leads to people wanting to throw their hands up in the air, turn away or shut down. And we can sometimes see this happening when we overuse a crisis framing that we hear in the media. People, the general public can be overwhelmed by the extent of an issue, and I'll get to the strategy, but without sharing something alongside that, we risk that the fatalistic mindset is what's dominant as we're starting to talk about something that's really valuable and important. The third one is otherism. So this idea that it's those kids over there or that community over there that's the problem, and there's this us and them of groups that's created. We often find that when we have activated that mindset or thinking about that mindset, we stereotype, and people think about it from a point of view of, well, if they get something extra, I'm going to miss out, so I'm not there to support that. And it often comes with a deficit and judging behavior or judging attitude. But there's strategies to counterbalance that. We're going to look at ways we widen the lens to counterbalance the individualism, explain what shapes and surrounds us by explaining environments and relationships that support outcomes. We can balance the urgency with efficacy. So we can balance to avoid fatalism. So we offer explanations and solutions. We show rather than tell, and not only communicate how important or urgent a concern is, but also what are some of the effective solutions or next steps or something that activates our sense of innovation and optimism. We want to do that. One of the ways to do that is to limit our overuse of negative data or crisis language, but we'll talk about that a little bit further. We want to highlight collectivism. So the idea that we explain much more bring to the forefront how we are all interdependent, our collective responsibility, rather than the otherism. So we can do that with avoiding some of the labels of certain subgroups like vulnerable or at risk kind of backfires on us. We might know what we mean by that in the sector, but it backfires in eliciting that us and them mentality. So I don't have the opportunity here to go deeply into the research methodology, and I know we've got researchers in the room. I can point you to where that comes from, but with each piece of research that has been done here in Australia, there's not only the report and the methodology, but they've also looked at what do we implement, what's implementable, and so they've often provided a toolkit and some examples of how we can use this work. So my role's been around learning about this, uplifting these, looking at how do we implement some of these recommendations. And so it's really good to know that these recommend frames is not just someone's opinion, they're based on a robust testing process that has happened. Two big pieces of framing work in Australia has been around how we raise our kids. To Parenting Research Centre commissioned some work, and it was really the big finding out of that, and you'll see the shift has happened since this work in 2018, away from parenting's a struggle, we need to uplift skills in parenting, to what kids need, start with what kids needs first in our language, and start with children's needs first, and then talk about what supports parents and families and communities need to bring them up. There's also a fantastic piece of work, how to tell the core story of early childhood. And these two pieces of work give us a really deep understanding about how the Australian public think and feel about parenting and child development, and some practical frames and tools. There's other research here in Australia. Here's a sampling of them from frameworks around disability, prevention, climate change in children, child mental health, etc. So although we've got these individual pieces of research, there's some overarching recommendations around how we tell a story and the importance of ordering in that story. We start with that big frame, that big value that's been tested and found to be the most effective. We make sure we're not triggering individualism or otherism or fatalism. We look at how we explain the cause before we go into mentioning the effects, and we use that we got lots of opportunities to use explanatory metaphors in that, and looking at how we offer solutions or arrows towards change. But we want to support the story with data because data is really powerful and very important. We want to support it with images as well. So I'm going to move into uh, the unpacking how we support this with data. So it's important, but it needs context. We need the story around the data. We've got access to really good, robust data in Australia, whether it's the Australian Child Atlas map, whether it's different significant pieces of research work. But just because we have a lot of data doesn't mean we need to use it all. We want to be selective about it. This image I'm about to show you always makes me laugh because a group of climate scientists wanted to come to frameworks and say, can you help us frame we want the public to understand the urgency and the solutions around climate change. And this is what they brought to bring. They thought this is all the information that the public needed to know to be convinced that climate change was something that was needed action now. And you can see it's overwhelming. It's really difficult to understand. The conversation went, oh, we need this green line because it is the Southern Hemisphere's Antarctica curve of, such and such. But really, we needed something much more straightforward. And we can laugh, but then we can probably see ourselves in this a little bit. We know that we've seen things, pages of data, and we like to put icons with them and pictures, but still, this doesn't always make sense to the general public. What does that number mean in relation to what? It's information overload, and it's hard to see what the data is trying to say. So to tell a compelling story with data from this framing perspective is we want to start with the big value frame that we can glean from the reports. There's the big three, but there's also specific ones if we're having a specific topic we're in mind. We want to choose the data well to support your story. When we're using the data, we want to use social maths to make that data relatable. So that's that idea of a number it's difficult to understand what a big number means. So you might want to say, imagine a classroom of children in an average Australian school, 10 students for every class across Australia experience X, Y, or Z. Makes a little bit more relatable. Or it might be that you want to use the size of a stadium. If we can fill the size of a stadium 10 times over with this quantity of such and such. So finding ways to really relate it back to something that the general public that we want to influence understands. We want to highlight structures and not struggles. So what I mean by that is your data is quite powerful. So when we choose which data we're going to use, if we connect it to what is happening for an individual person, the struggle of an individual person, then people think about the solution is about the person. But if we connect the data that highlights structures or systems, then we can then more easily think about what are the systems changes that might need to happen to support the change we need. So we don't want to be fixing people. We want to be fixing the systems and this context around a person, because we know that what we might. Yeah, I won't expand because I'll make sure I leave enough time for Angela. And again, this piece around balancing urgency and efficacy. So it took me a while so we want, pause for a moment. We want the issue that we're speaking about, whether it's around youth justice or early years or what it might be, homelessness, we want people to understand that this is an urgent issue and needs action now. But when we only speak about the urgency, because when we use the gravity of we explain the gravity of the issue without offering some effective solutions or actions or something to begin to elicit a pragmatic, optimistic, innovative approach, whatever might be there. We might not always have every solution for our issue. If we don't have that balance right, we can end with either people feeling overwhelmed by the size and complexity of a problem, or we can end with people understand that that's a great program, but they're not really that motivated to support action now. So we want to get that balance right. And data is a powerful part of that story. And so in all of this, we're looking at widening the lens around the circumstances of whatever the issue, whether we're talking about young people, children, families, to include the context, because we know that we often might hear a story of a young person that's done well, and there is elements that's absolutely about that young person, but there's also elements about the youth worker that believed in them when they didn't have that at home, or the stories of they lived in a community that was privileged with good quality access to services, whereas another young person with the same ability and character be living in a different community. So we really want to highlight that, because that's where big picture change is going to happen when we see a broad systems change. So I've got a couple of examples. One's live in my world at the moment. We were asked to have a bit of a framing lens check, I guess, on some work that's coming out. And it was really obvious that people were passionate about their data to be clear, and there was multiple points of data. But it was interesting, with just shifting some of the headings around how those data was grouped, we could use the same data and tell a slightly different story. So, for instance, a colleague of mine was like, rather than saying data is revealing a concerning picture, we could say data is telling us clearly we need to do more. Rather than saying escalating mental health concerns, we could shift that to a headline that talks about prioritizing mental health concerns. The same data could be under those headlines, but those headlines give the reader a different frame to take that data in. Another partner that we've worked with has really shifted their whole strategy and their communication. And it was really obvious when I looked back and saw something they had produced about 4 years ago. And it was like maybe 10 slides of how awful the circumstances are for some young people across Australia, and then one slide about what they wanted to do about it. And then their current explanation of their strategy and what they're doing is very different. It's talking about the opportunity and potential of young people in Australia, in their communities, and how they're supporting that. So just a real flip. That's then they have reported they're finding a really different engagement with young people and also with funders and partners. So it's super exciting that they've seen the value of taking that shift and moving away from overwhelm. This is just one example, leading with data. You might start with 700 women die in the US in 2019 from a pregnancy-related complication. Or you might want to lead with values to what is it, and this example starts with, to ensure that everyone has full and fair chance for health and well-being, we can take steps to prevent the 80% of pregnancy-related deaths. So just a different way of leading. The data is still powerful, because 80% of the pregnancy-related deaths are preventable, according to this. The data is a very powerful piece, but how we start it can affect how we think and feel, and what action we take about what we've heard. So I'm going to recognize that I've just passed my 20-minute moment. I will just flag here, there are some resources here that we're going to share after we hear from Angela, but I'm going to unshare my slide show so that we can hear from Angela, and then we'll come back together and go, so what does this framing look like in combination of hearing Angela's experience with the Australian Youth Survey?
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Angela Higginson. As Nadia introduced me earlier, I am an associate professor at the School of Justice at QUT in Brisbane. And I'd also like to acknowledge that the Turrbal and Yagara people are the First Nations owners of the lands where QUT now stands, and of course pay respects to their elders, laws, customs and creation spirits, and recognise that those have been places of teaching and learning for millennia. I also want to acknowledge the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within the QUT community, and also within, of course, the community much broader than simply QUT. And I'd like to particularly pay my respects to the Yagara people whose lands I live and work on at Tulma, which is Ipswich in Queensland. So a little bit about me. I've done a little bit of a journey from being a purely quantitative criminologist through to thinking a lot more about those stories and how to tell them, and how to gather data that tells stories rather than gives me only a very large set of numbers to play with. So my background is in psychology, in philosophy, and in statistics in terms of my training. And I've been a researcher in criminology now for about 13 years or so. The majority of my work has focused on that really big picture view of things with systematic reviews and meta-analysis in the crime and justice space. So bringing together all of the research that other people have performed on the ground to see what that big picture looks like, and see sort of what the risks and everything look like there. Now, I've moved into spaces, however, over the last few years, which are focused more on young people. Youth gangs has been an area that I've worked in a fair amount, and lately I've been looking more at hate crime, anti-immigrant sentiment. So that's sort of the kind of work that I've been doing. The main work I'm doing at the moment, of course, what I'm here to talk about today, is the Australian and also New Zealand now youth safety surveys. So these are very large collections of data where I've got online surveys that ask young people to tell me about identity, diversity, and safety in their experiences today. So the young people that I talk to are typically aged between 14 and 25, although with some changes around both ethics requirements in New Zealand, but also around the use of social media, which is where we recruit. We're unfortunately going to have to be pushing that to 16 to 25-year-olds, which I find very disappointing because it means I miss those voices of the really younger cohort here that we'd like to talk to. Now, this is a survey, as I said, I'm focused around things like hate crime. That's my real area of interest. But this survey is so much bigger and so much broader. It takes between about 30 to 50 minutes for a young person to complete. And that's going to depend, obviously, on their own experiences and how many of these experiences they've had and would like to talk about. So I ask them all about their attitudes to things like ethnicity, immigration, police, but also their experiences, not just at the individual level of their own sense of self, but also how they interact with their family, with their peers, with their school, and what's going on in their neighborhood. So trying to really nest that young person, not just as an individual, but as a contextually framed young person as well, and look across the country quite broadly. And of course, I do also ask them about their experiences of both victimization and offending. This research was initially funded by the Australian Research Council under the branding of ethnically motivated youth hate crime in Australia. But as it's turned out, that isn't actually where the majority of our youth hate crime is focused. And so the topics become a little broader over the last few years. Now, I will admit I've never until very recently actually heard of framing in this specific way. And so this is also really quite new to me. And it's really allowing me to reflect a lot on the way in which I do storytelling with data. And the elements that I think I have in common in a lot of ways with the way that the framing structure appears to be working is that I'm thinking about things along the line of who my audience is and recognizing that that can vary quite considerably. And therefore, the way that I tell the stories is going to vary. But one of the main areas that I've been focused on is thinking about the agency of the young people whose stories we're actually telling, who owns those stories, who owns that data, and how we really need to respect the autonomy of those young people whilst also balancing their communities. And of course, one of the last 2 points I have here when I'm thinking about storytelling is what can I explain? But also what can't I explain? Because certainly within academia, we tend to take a slice of the story, and I'm not going to be able to necessarily see that story all the way from collecting data about the problem to necessarily providing an effective solution. But we tell our stories within components of that pathway. So in terms of audiences, my very first audience for this project was the Australian Research Council, where I put in a funding application in about 2018 for this project. And this is the story that I told them. You get about 100 words at the beginning that's meant to catch someone with a grant application, and this was mine. And I did start with the urgency, and I hope that you'll see that I've balanced with efficiency or effectiveness at the end of this. So I start by saying that hate crime has more severe impacts than non-hate crime. This is true. It can cause injury, psychological harm, social disengagement, and rethinking of ethnic identity. But for victims in early adolescence, which is a critical time of identity formation, those harms can be multiplied. But little is known about youth hate crime. Again, very true. This was the big academic gap that I'm seeking to fill. So this project aims to provide the first assessment of youth hate crime in Australia, examine incident rates over time, and explore how Australia's experiences compare internationally. It aims to uncover the risk factors, but also the protective factors for both perpetration and victimization, and to understand those consequences for hate crime victims. And those insights will benefit the community by helping to inform social policy to improve the lives of Australia's youth. So very much within this framing to the biggest customer audience member, I suppose, or the initial audience member, really did have to frame this is a really big problem. This can potentially cause harms across so many areas of society. But if we find out what we can do to address those risks, if we can look at what protects young people, then maybe we can make social change, and that's important. Of course, they're not the only audience. They were simply our first one. And the way that we tell these stories is going to vary for those different audiences. So I have other academics. As I said, we tend to do a slice of the puzzle. The majority of the work that I've been doing is actually about identifying the size of the problem and identifying what those risk and protective factors can be and how those relate. If I do that, someone else can then pick up my academic paper and go, oh, very big problem, can see all of these possibilities for places that we can go next, can design interventions. Someone else will probably trial those interventions. Someone else will test those interventions. Eventually, we, as a social collective, can provide answers for the Australian public, for public internationally. That's the aim anyway. Other audiences are policymakers and will frame things quite differently for a policymaker. I'm not going to give them, of course, the chart that was shown earlier with the climate change data. I love that kind of thing, but I'm not sharing that with the policymaker. They're not going to talk to me after I do that. And so small briefing papers are more of the way to go there. And of course, we want to share back to the young people themselves. These are people who've shared their stories with us. And so we want to share back with them what they as a collective whole have told us. And finally, we want to think about sending messages through to the general public. So here's a bit of a slice. It's not yet published. It's a piece for the conversation where we're looking about, why some people might be attracted to gangs and what are actually some solutions. And again, that's some data that we've got from this survey. So lots of different audiences and lots of people who are telling the stories. So I've so far collected 3 waves of data for the Australian Youth Safety Survey from just before COVID hit us all the way through to last year. And I've heard from now, we've got over 5,000 completed surveys. Some of these people have come back year after year to talk to us again and tell us about how their worlds are. We've also recently branched out to New Zealand. And so last year and this year, we've done waves and will continue to do that and have got over 1,500 completed surveys. And when you think about the size of the population in New Zealand of young people, it may look like a small number, but it's actually really fantastic for us in terms of representation. Again, as I said, these are quite young people. And one of the things that was really important to us when we talk about young people having agency to tell their stories is that they should be able to make that decision themselves. I had to put together some quite strong arguments for our ethics panels to ensure that we didn't need parental consent. That was successful. There are plenty of reasons to believe that a 14-year-old should not have to ask their parents to talk about their innermost lives with researchers if they choose. These are young people who are allowed to have jobs, are allowed to see doctors independent of their parents, they're allowed to be sent to youth detention at younger ages than 14. So we considered that they were mature enough to make their own decisions there, and luckily our ethics panel agreed with us there. I did have some feedback from one young person in the first wave that felt really good about that. We asked them if they'd like to enter a prize draw at the end of the survey as a thank you for a gift card. And one of the young people had said in an open-ended comment field at the end of the first survey that she'd love to have done that, but she was more worried that if a gift card had rocked up at her house, that her parents would start asking questions. And it was really important to her to be able to tell, to engage with this without her parents knowing, because that would have actually induced danger into her situation. So yes, very happy to be able to give those young people that agency that they actually want. And we had a lot of feedback from young people simply saying thank you for the opportunity to tell their stories, which is, again, really fantastic to hear. The young people that I spoke to are an incredibly diverse group of young people across the years. This is data just from the second wave of Australian surveys. It doesn't shift terribly much. What we can see here is I've asked young people how they identify their gender. I haven't asked them which box they want to tick. I've used their words, and then we've sort of categorized down. And the diversity is incredible within the gender and sexuality space with young people, and becoming increasingly more so. So we see that the majority, 64%, 2/3, are cisgendered young people, but we see 10% of no longer identifying in the same way as they were identified at birth, and 26% of young people pick a non-binary gender diverse option for describing themselves. Young people also have a great deal of diversity around their sexuality. The first wave, we had a lot more straight young people. Now we're literally seeing, if you give them boxes to choose from between being straight, gay or lesbian, bisexual, or another option that they might prefer to tell you about, it's almost split evenly across those boxes now. Young people also were asked about their any disabilities that they might have, and only 40% of young people said that they didn't live with some form of disability. And we didn't ask them to only include something that was diagnosed, recognizing that for some young people, and adults, mental health diagnoses, ADHD and ASD diagnoses are in fact very, very difficult to come by. But most young people identified as having some of those challenges in their lives. And finally, we were quite representative across ethnicities. 87% of the young people who spoke to us were born in Australia. Roughly 30% were a second generation immigrant. These are basically the numbers that we see in the general population. The kinds of stories that they tell us also vary in terms of the difficulties that they experience. So here are just some quotes from some of the young people that we spoke to. A first person says that they're struggling with their identity. They don't know who to turn to. Their friends don't understand. Their mum is homophobic. All the way through to, we see a young man, second from the bottom, just saying that identity is bullshit. It's just enforcing an agenda to fry the minds of the youth. Diversity is globalism trying to ruin white countries and, excuse the language, turn them into shitholes. So we're not only seeing pro-social young people, and we're not only seeing young people in distress. We have a lot of young people have spoken to us about very diverse experiences. In the evolution of this project included our working with another set of researchers, Dr. Suzanne Widlitska, who's at the University of Auckland, and also Dr. Catherine Benier, who is at the Monash University. And we took our survey into the New Zealand context. Now, doing that, we definitely made a really clear shift into focusing around strength-based stories, asking young people what it was that helped them through. If they experienced one of these issues, what help did they seek? Who was helpful to them? Where they actually found support in their lives, so that we could really highlight those coping strategies. It was also really important for us, however, to recognise that there is always the potential for abuse and misrepresentation of data around young people, but particularly politically, especially around Indigenous data. So in the context of New Zealand, about 17% of young people are Maori, and so it was very important that a broader consultation process was underway that considered Maori data sovereignty in particular, but also used Te Reo Maori, the language of Maori people, in translations, so that we were recognising that we were talking about a dual language culture. And we had to really embrace this challenge between the individual participant and their rights to privacy, but also the fact that we are required and should ethically be sharing any data that's requested by the Maori iwi, the tribes that those young people are affiliated with. And so basically our solution there was simply to tell young people that we would be sharing that data with their iwi on request. And so, you know, really reinforcing, if you don't want that to happen, please don't tell us what your iwi is. Right, so what can we try to explain about young people's lives? Firstly, we can do some attempts to explain simply what is happening, to describe what those problems look like. But also, because I have a huge data set with a lot of variables there about young people's identities, we can look at those intersections of different layers of identity and see how that impacts victimization. We can look at what the impact of victimization is for young people in the future, particularly for those young people who were lovely enough to share their experiences year on year. We can focus on not only those risk factors with a deficit framing, but also those protective factors. And of course, see how we might be able to intersect there with those struggles for young people to actually come up with solutions. And in doing so, we want to think about, well, who else is there? When these things are happening, what is the social and structural environment where we may be able to actually call for assistance or train people to help in these situations. And of course, where do young people draw their strength? Now, I recognize that I've probably gone well over time, so I'm just going to talk incredibly quickly about the problem of hate victimization, which is basically across either hate speech, hate violence, and cyber hate. So these are basically being either threatened or verbally abused because of these identity characteristics, physically assaulted because of those characteristics, or having social media, the internet, or a mobile phone being used. What's important to recognize is that the young people who experience one of these forms of victimization typically experience more than one form of this victimization. And that's particularly the case for young people who experience cyber hate. The majority of those, nearly 60%, experience either hate speech or violence. For those young people who end up in a situation where they've been victimized violently, they have also experienced almost universally hatred through the internet or in-person speech. It's something that happens to our most vulnerable young people who aren't white, young people who aren't cisgendered, young people who aren't straight. And it's typically when someone is assaulted with one of these forms of victimization, it doesn't just pick necessarily their most obvious target of discrimination, but rather the offender will typically pick on more than one aspect. If they can find any chink in someone's sense of identity, they can attack through those. So it's a really multifaceted problem. It's not something that's happening in the shadows. About a third of these incidents happen at school, and 1 in 5 are happening either in their own home or someone else's home. So these are places where people should be able to feel safe, and they don't. And it's not strangers doing this. The vast majority of young people know who their offender is. It's typically a friend or an acquaintance, but it can, certainly when it comes to violence around someone's identity, and often this is for queer young people, it's parents and family members who are actually doing the violence. Finally, in terms of how we frame ourselves talking to our public, this is the key takeaways from an invited submission to the New Zealand Law Commission, who are looking at changing their hate crime laws and expanding their hate crime laws. They didn't have any data about what's happening to young people because young people don't report, basically, but also they just don't have the frameworks yet to do it. So we provided the data that we had. And yes, it is very much an urgency-based framing. Young people are experiencing hate violence and hate speech at alarming levels, even though this survey doesn't actually focus specifically on hate crime. It's being reported incredibly commonly. And gender and sexuality are in fact the targets that are most common, even though most of us, I think, frame hate crime as something that's ethnically motivated, and it is. It's actually much more common for young people who are queer. Young people are not safe in public spaces. They're not safe at home, but most of these incidents are witnessed by other people, and that gives us an opportunity to intervene. And finally, we have a real problem around young people not wanting to report hate speech or hate violence to police, and we've collected information on why that is. But we need to recognise the difference between what we see in official statistics and what we see when people report to us. So we can't explain a few things, can't explain a lot of things. We can't explain the offender perspective yet. We haven't got to the point of being able to speak with young people, enough young people to be able to be sure that we can capture that perspective well. And we don't know what interventions work. But we do know that we're starting to identify those potential inflection points, places where we can come in and actually make an impact. And I will leave it at that. So thank you very much.
Right, back over to you, Naomi, for a quick look at the resources we can use now.
Nadia,
Sorry,
are you able to
Naomi, you're on
unshare me?
mute. Oh,
Mute. I'm off. Thank you, Angela. It's so good to hear you've got such a rich body of research and information and data around the experiences for young people and the issues that they're facing. It's really important. And I think as I listen to you, I can see the power of the questions you ask. So even that shift you made in going to New Zealand and asking questions about what supports you in this space, the research question and the questions you ask can be so valuable in how we draw dilemmas of what's the next steps we need to take, because we do want to see change for this. It's not okay that that number of young people are experiencing those kinds of hate crimes and other pieces. So the framing data, framing recommendations, you use it in different ways for different spaces. I think a number of us that are on the call might not be researchers. They might be people who are loving that kind of research, going, I can use this data to put in my funding application because I've got something that I'm trialing about this and I want the data to support my application. And so I guess the reminders is how we can do that. I did say I would always takes me a little moment. No, not from the beginning. Goodness. Oh, it's going to be. Sorry. I'm not going to do it. Sorry, too many things. I do have in the chat, I did pop in the chat our Framing Learning Hub. Sorry, the background, I am slipping through the slides to get to the resource slide for us. Always the way gets a little difficult. Here we go. My apologies. So we start this again. Share screen from current slide. Here we go. So hopefully you're seeing that. Is that right? Yes. So yeah, just wanted to encourage you to think about, can you see opportunities where you can use framing in your work? We've got a checklist and other resources that we've produced to help our partners with this. There's many different short ways you can engage to learn a little bit more. You can, whoa, it's really flicking through now. You can watch, read an article, watch a short video stream, or take the time to listen to a 45-minute, keynote around framing, even from Nat Kendall-Taylor, who's the CEO. We've got all of these things collated together on the Framing for Change Learning Hub. I guess the one thing I would like us to take away, let's stop now before that happens. One thing I'd like us to take away is just to be mindful about how we use our data, that we are using it in a way that isn't going to trigger fatalism and just turn people away from our conversation, that we're using it in a way that's not going to leave somebody thinking it's the solution is in the individual, because the blame is in the individual, and we don't want people to walk away thinking it's only about somebody else and it doesn't affect me. What's good for our young people is good for our whole community. What is good for, if we have an environment where that violence isn't experienced by young people, we have an environment that we all feel safe. And so if we can utilize those checklists to help us reminder or join, feel free to join community practices to learn about this more. And as for researchers, I love that you're doing this deep research that we can draw from, and the way you pose your questions and your research questions is really powerful in the way that we can be all part of the story. As you said, Angela, we all take a slice, how we can all be part of the story to see change. So it does say, as Amy's just put in the chat, run out of room for Q&A. There are some, my understanding is that Amy will be collecting those questions that you put along the way, and we'll have some job to do afterwards to see what we can get back to you. I'm going to pass back to Nadia, because maybe that's what you're meant to say at the end.
No, thank you.
But thank you everyone for having both of us. Yeah.
Yes, Amy's also put the poll in the chat, and so that's an opportunity to give feedback and answer some questions based on the webinar, but also on the fantastic presentations of our guest speakers. So really encourage you to take that poll and provide your feedback. So I'll just wrap up now. In terms of membership, the Research and Evaluation Network is open to everyone, as it's about sharing resources and collaboration. However, social service staff in research and evaluation roles are particularly encouraged to attend our webinars. As a friendly reminder, we also have the network forum that sits within the Microsoft Teams platform, and the instructions on how to join this forum are in the chat pane. And as with this recording and all previous recordings we have for the network, they can be found on our Community Door Research and Evaluations Hub page. The link will be in the chat, but also in the post-event email. And finally, we are just a few weeks away from the 2025 QCOS conference Changing State. So don't miss your chance to be a part of an inspiring days where we'll dream, dare and do, exploring bold ideas, practical solutions and the future of our sector together. I will be facilitating a session on innovating for a fair go, where I'll be joined by Orange Sky Laundry founders Nick Marchesi and Lucas Patchett, as well as Luke Terry from White Box Enterprises and Peggy Flannery from Peggy's Place, and they'll share how their organizations are purposefully harnessing innovation to deliver social change. There's also sessions on evidence-based practice, which is particularly valuable for those in research and evaluation roles within the community service sector. All details for the conference and the registration will be in the chat now. As today's webinar was focused on framing research and data around children and young people, we wanted to share with you that the Australian Child and Youth Wellbeing Atlas has been updated, and the platform now includes new features, enhanced data tools and improved designs, making it easier to explore child and youth wellbeing insights across Australia. You can access this resource directly or via QCOS data point, and the link will be in the chat. So thank you for staying online and engaging with us in today's session. A very big thank you to Naomi and Angela again for your presentation today. We look forward to connecting in our next webinar, which will be our last one for the year. So take care until then and have a great day, everyone. Our contact details are on the slide and again in the chat if you would like to reach out to provide feedback or ask any questions about today's session or anything else to do with the network. Thank you so much.